أنا ديني محمد وآل محمد صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم قامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلق منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا شريك لهم ولهم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آيات من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا ونطعموا من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يقسمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لتمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسقناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلق قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحيي الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم. محمد وآل محمد صلوات. کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا دل والوں کی آنکھوں سے ایک دریا بہائے گا وہ کارواں سرور کا جو شان سے نکلا تھا سگرا کو خبر کیا تھی نہ لوٹ کے آئے گا مہمان بلایا ہے اے کوفی و سرور کو کیا کنبہ شہیدی کا پانی نہیں پائے گا پامال ہوا قاسم یوں گوروں کی ٹاپوں سے پامال ہوا قاسم یوں گوروں کی ٹاپوں سے کس طرح چچا تیری میت کو اٹھائیں گا تھا ہاتھوں کا کٹنے کا کچھ غم نہ دلاور کو تھا ہاتھوں کا کٹنے کا کچھ غم نہ دلاور کو سیدانیوں کا پردہ اب کون بچائے گا ٹوٹی ہے کمر شیکی گھبرانا مگر اکبر ٹوٹی ہے کمر شیکی گھبرانا مگر اکبر فرزند نبی تیری لاشے کو اٹھائیں گا سوتے نہ تھے تم اصغر جھولے میں تڑپتے تھے سوتے نہ تھے تم اصغر جھولے میں تڑپتے تھے دنیا کو خبر کیا تھی ایک تیر سلائیں گا کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا محمد وآل محمد صلوات
السلام علیکم ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ. Please recite Surah Fatiha for the names displayed on the screens and all marhumin, mu'minin wal mu'minat. Al-Fatiha. Dua Shifa is also requested for Hassan Ali Yusuf Muhammad and Muslim Barwani and all those mu'mineen, mu'minat who are either unwell or suffering tonight. Dua Shifa. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أمن يجيب المضطر إذا ويكشف السوء من يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Can we now please welcome Sheikh Mohammed al-Hilli to the minbar with a loud salawat.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف خلقه وخاتم أنبيائه وسيد رسله سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المطهرين المكرمين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في كتابه الكريم وهو أحسن القائلين وأصدق الصادقين: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the purification of the souls, the enlightening of the hearts, the acceptance of the deeds, and for the hastening of the reappearance of the awaited Saviour, Ajr Allah Ta'ala Farajuh Sharif. Enlighten your souls, purify the atmosphere with the recitation of salawat upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Respected elders, sisters and brothers, Salamun Alaikum wa Rahmatullahi Ta'ala wa Barakatuh. What is the theological legacy of the 10th Imam, Imam Ali ibn Muhammad al-Naqi al-Hadi, salawatullahi wa salamu alayh? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless the mu'mineen and mu'minat across the world who are gathered on a night like this, or a night like last night due to moon sighting, whereby they have gathered to honor the legacy of the 10th Holy Imam, midweek. And indeed, the 10th Holy Imam with the 9th Imam, the 11th Imam, are Imams of the Ahl al-Bayt that sadly are not necessarily as looked up to by many, in the idea that when we look at the remembrance of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhum as-salam, I remember when I first began to give majalis in the English language to the primarily Khoja community, Pakistani community, Indian community, I was introduced to a term which till now I'm struggling with. The term was big Kushali and small Kushali. Big wafat, small wafat. The idea that I was introduced with is that when it comes to Amir al-Mu'mineen, his birth celebration is grand. His Shahadah is grand. When it comes to Sayyid al-Shuhada, Muharram, no doubt. When it comes to the Lady of Light, it's what? It's huge. When it comes to, for example, the Prophet of Islam, no doubt. But when it comes to, for example, the 9th Imam, or the 10th Imam, or the 11th Imam, or for that matter, sometimes even the seventh Imam, arguably, there is an idea that perhaps their remembrance, their teachings, their legacy is not as critical for people to understand as the earlier Imams. And that idea sadly exists within the mindsets of some of our communities, despite the importance that many a times the ulama have given to the remembrance of all the Ahl al-Bayt alayhum as-salam. And that reminds me, interestingly also, when it comes to Muharram, the first 10 nights, I sometimes go to communities, they tell me the attendance on the 7th night is greater than the 9th night. I say to them, why? They say, 7th night is Hazrat Abbas night. I say to them, this Hazrat Abbas night is a beautiful reminder of his excellence and his bravery. But this night was placed by people, not by the Ahl al-Bayt. But Maulana, 7th night, don't mess with it. Other nights, no problem. I'll watch from home, eating popcorn. In the recognition that what? That sometimes we have constructed our own understanding of some of the ways in which we should honor and revere Ali Muhammad. And sometimes we need to re-examine. And I know that I'm preaching to the converted, that may Allah bless those who are on a midweek, on a rainy night, yes, in the middle of what? Of London, or the south of London, where we are in a position where it's easy to be inclined to stay home and to watch, for example. I add my voice to those who object to live transmission, but I can't say anything because it makes people lazy, without a shadow of a doubt. No doubt it allows some people who are unable to come for legitimate reasons, elderly, sick, those with children, but the rest, it gives them a green light not to make the effort. And that exists and will only get worse. The theological legacy of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam needs to be looked at, especially as we are remembering the Shahadah of the 10th Imam, Imam Ali al-Hadi salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This has been discussed by a number of non-Muslim authors and researchers, interestingly, when they come to ask a very important question that perhaps has existed in our minds. What has gone wrong with the Muslim Ummah today? People have these discussions. Why are we where we are today as far as the Muslim community around the world? Why aren't we the leading community when it comes to scientific advancement, educational establishments? When it comes to, for example, the latest medical research, why isn't Muslim countries at the forefront of development, at the forefront of advancement in so many of the world's areas and disciplines? What has happened? What's wrong with us? Why have we reached where we are today? There are those who have presented some theories. Some say it's the problem with religion. Religion, they say, brings people backward. It doesn't allow advancement, doesn't give you the capability to look beyond. It restricts human beings. For example, I remember that Boris Johnson wrote in his book, in the appendix of his works, in regards to the role of religion. The book is called Dreams of Rome, a survey of the Roman Empire. In the appendix he says, there must be something wrong with Islam that caused them to be centuries behind, unquote. An individual who subscribes to the idea that religion brings back human beings and doesn't allow advancement. He and others have argued that when it comes to, for instance, the idea of the Reformation, the separation between state and the church, that enabled Europe and other places to develop. Otherwise, they would not have gained what they have today if it wasn't for the separation between religion and state. The problem with this idea is it's rejected. Why? Because the religion of Islam, for example, came to 7th century Arabia, backward, where people were enslaved, where women were inherited, where girls were being buried, there were no systems. And in the recognition of actual non-Muslim authors and historians, Islam gave that particular area, and then when it was spread across different parts, much to be hopeful, and developed a lot of systems, developed people's lives, gave them a better standard of living. For example, William Montgomery Watt in 1976 wrote a book. The book is entitled The Majesty That Was Islam. A non-Muslim historian, Scottish, writes about how Islam changed the lives of people positively. Therefore, this theory cannot be accepted. A group of others have come forward and said, listen, the reason why Muslims today are not where we should find them, if they claim to have the best religion and the best role models, is because they are not following Sharia. People will tell you that the religion of Islam has brought forward Sharia law. Sharia law, if it's not followed, of course people will go astray. And this is given as one of the reasons. Partly true, no doubt. But Islam is not only made up of Sharia. It's made up of what? Spirituality, akhlaq. There is a dimension of politics, social studies, other areas that are linked to Sharia but are also studied in other ways. Therefore, that could be taken, but it's not a complete reason. A third group of people have come and said the reason why Islam is not as advanced as you expected is because others have dictated on Muslim lands their rules and they have stopped Muslims from developing. Wars, aggressions, invasions, and the usurping of the wealth and the possessions of Muslims. So many people will say Islam today has not been allowed to flourish. Islam has not been allowed to breathe so that it can encapsulate the world with its magnificent teachings because Muslims are always oppressed. How do you respond to this? There is a difference between being oppressed and allowing oneself to be oppressed. There are those who say that indeed throughout the course of history, Muslims have opened the way for others to rule over them, to dictate over them, due to, for example, divisions, due to, for example, lack of vision, lack of planning. And the idea, therefore, that exists is not always possible to blame others for one's failure. It's an easy way out, yes? That's why a man by the name of what? A man by the name of Robert Riley. He's a diplomat and writer. This book that he wrote is very interesting. He discusses one of the main reasons why Muslims today are not where they should be. The book is called The Closing of the Muslim Mind: How Intellectual Suicide Created Modern Islamist Crisis. What does he say? Please understand, because I want to bring you to the role of the 10th Imam, which he refers to in this book. The idea that he projects is what? Is that when it came to Muslims, there was a problem that emerged 3rd century after Hijrah. And that was the phenomenon of the Ash'arites. Today, the majority of the Muslim world, who are not from the school of Ahl al-Bayt, belong to the Ash'arite school of theology. You know, when we speak about Hanbalites, when we speak about, for example, Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi'i, these are jurisprudential schools. We're talking about theological schools. Theological schools today that exist are mainly what? Ash'arites, Abadis in Oman, Ithna Ashari, Shias, and a few Mu'tazilites if they still remain. However, the majority are Ash'arites. The emergence of the school of Ash'arite theology in 3rd century Hijrah is identified as one of the main reasons why the Muslim world is where it is today. You say to me, how? Explain to me. I want to understand. What do these Ash'arites believe that caused Islam today not to be advanced? He, as a non-Muslim author, writes, he says Ash'arite theology dismisses the role of intellect, aql, belittles it, says the role of narrations is far greater than intellectual thought. And therefore, there was the introduction of a vast number of narrations which were accepted and were not allowed to be disputed because they did not match with the intellect. And as time progressed, people's ability to use aql, rational thought, intellectual discourse became weaker and weaker as the Bani Abbas adopted this theology, enforced it on the people, and reduced people's ability to come up with new ideas. Let me explain. Ash'arite theology, for example, began by presenting some narrations, like the following. They said there is a narration about how God was created. To start off with, it's a problem. But they say you cannot use the aql. You have to accept this narration. عندما أراد الله أن يخلق نفسه. When Allah wanted to create himself. خلق خيلا. He created a horse. It's quite bizarre and ridiculous to you and I. But this was something Bani Abbas pushed that people have to believe. He created a horse. وأجراه, and made him run. ثم عرق. After he ran, the horse began to have sweat. ثم خلق نفسه من عرق الخيل. Then he created himself from the sweat of the horse. These kind of narrations were espoused. Why? Because one of the fundamental beliefs was tajseem, the apomorphism. Yes? When an individual believes that God the Almighty has human characteristics, human features. This was something that gradually theological schools at that time were taught and was enforced upon the people. As time went on, what happened was scholars emerged that dismissed the role of the intellect. They said there is a very interesting theory that is discussed or belief within the school of Ahl al-Bayt and Mu'tazilites, and that is what is called al-Tahsin wa al-Taqbih. What does that mean? It means there are things which are good identified by the aql and are things which are identified as bad by the intellect. Doesn't need religion to tell you. They said no, that cannot be accepted. If things are bad, we still accept them if there is a narration that says you should, even if the aql rejects. For example, Shaitan, you and I know, the aql tells us that he is evil. They say no. If there is a narration that says Shaitan is good, we have to accept. We have to take the narration and reject any kind of intellectual thought. As a result, there emerged a number of scholars who brought forth some kind of ideologies which completely dismissed the ability of the aql to look beyond and to, for example, find discoveries, to go into, for example, areas related to astronomy. All these things were made into haram. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah, one of those who utilized this. What does he say? He says, Al-Kimya min ashad al-muharramat. Chemistry is one of the worst haram things. Anybody studied chemistry here at university or as a chemist? Please go and visit the grave of Ibn Taymiyyah in Sham. In the recognition that he says what? You are committing haram. Study chemistry. Why? There is an involvement of the aql sciences. There is an involvement of intellectual discourses. Even, for example, Ghazali, a very well-known Muslim scholar, he came forward and says, Tahafat al-falasifa. Falasifa, the philosophers have gone astray. Completely, all of them. Why? Because they utilize rational deductions and discourses. And therefore, what happened as a result? As a result, there was incredible stagnation and the declining of the Muslim state of affairs in its development. There was reluctance to use all kinds of sciences related to discourses which used intellect and intellectual reasoning. And that's why there was the increase in lies, fabrications within the society around the time of 3rd century after Hijrah. There was the rise of the belief in predeterminism. Meaning what? Meaning that God created us in a way that forces us to do certain things. We don't have free will. The intellect rejects this. Simply, isn't it? Because if God made us do things, why would He hold us accountable on the day of Qiyamah? Why would He reward us? Why would He punish us? This is an intellectual argument, isn't it? No. You can't use aql. That's it. You have to submit to the idea that there is what? Predeterminism. Yes? This idea of jabr. Similarly, what do we find? We find that anybody who is a narrator of hadith was raised, because they were told, narrate as many hadiths as you possibly can. And anyone who comes forth and objects to this will be punished, placed in prison. And this led rise to the legitimization of the actions of Bani Abbas. See, today, when you read history, you are told that there are certain groups that Bani al-Abbas opposed, like the Mu'tazilites, like the Alawis, the Shi'as. You begin to think it's because of the struggle for power. Maybe Abbasids were afraid of, yes, partly, but more importantly, they were worried about the aqaid and the beliefs of these groups, because the Mu'tazilites were on a completely opposite spectrum. They said, we don't use narrations, we only depend on aql. That was the opinion of the Mu'tazilites. And therefore, there was an incredibly strong opposition from Bani Abbas towards whom? Towards anyone who opposed the Ash'arite theology. And hence you find the likes of, for example, Ibn Sikkit. This individual, who was a follower of the Ahl al-Bayt, who was renowned and respected by Ali Muhammad, was an individual who was what? Executed by al-Mutawakkil al-Abbasi. Mutawakkil al-Abbasi, alayhi la'anullah, was amongst the most staunchest of the promoters of Ash'arite theology. He wanted and knew that in it lies what? The continuation of the power by the Abbasids. And therefore, what do we find? We find that as time progressed, people were not able to come out from this quagmire, from this difficulty. And constantly they were reminded. I'll give you a ruling that exists today. If there is a Muslim ruler who rules a Muslim land, the subjects, the people, are not allowed to rise against him. You know this exists today? Does it make sense? That even if the person is an oppressive individual, even if they're unjust, who came up with this? Who made this part of the aqidah, part of the belief? This is not jurisprudential, this is not fiqh. This is part of doctrines, belief that a Muslim ruler is what? Is characterized from the ayah in the Quran, وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. They have authority. Therefore, because they have authority and God has placed them, because otherwise they wouldn't rule the Muslim world if God doesn't want them to rule. And therefore, as a result, you and I or anyone else are not able to protest or demonstrate or call for them to be removed. This is where we have reached. And that's why this man, Robert Riley, in his book, when he talks about intellectual suicide, he speaks about Ash'arites, but he says there was only one group at that time who rose against this theology, and they were the Shia, he says. He says they were instrumental and hence were severely dealt with by the Abbasids. They were tortured, imprisoned, they were killed, massacred, money taken away from them, simply because they existed as the greatest theological threat to what Bani al-Abbas sought to establish. And that is the numbing of the minds and the thoughts of whom? Of the masses. I remember once there was an Abbasid king who made a competition. The competition was to come up with the best dress, for tailors to make the best dress. When he made this competition, two individuals thought of an idea based on what was being espoused at that time. They came forward and said, Your Majesty, this is the dress. He said, where is it? He said, there, we can, in front of you. There was nothing. He said to them, I can't see anything. They said, Your Majesty, this dress is so special. Only the intellectual ones, the ones with the real aql, can see it. He said, of course, I have aql. I am not somebody who, I can see it. I can see it. And therefore you're the winner. So when it was then shown to the people, he supposedly wore it, but he was only in his underwear. He came out on the throne sitting, everybody, he knew what was going on. They were told that only the ones who have aql can see it. If you don't, then you can't see it. There was a young child sitting next to his father. He said, Father, why is the king not wearing much? He said, be quiet, you don't have aql. in the recognition that this is how they numbed people's thinking. This is how they switched off or made people go through some kind of what? General anesthesia. Yes, numb them so that they don't question, so that they don't rise, so that they do not in any shape or form object to what? Object to the rule. When it came to the role of the 10th Imam, Ali al-Hadi, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. When we study his biography, we recognize that non-Muslim authors like this individual, Robert Riley and others, saw how he was instrumental in keeping the teachings of the religion of Islam alive by counteracting the beliefs of Bani al-Abbas. In this particular regard, the role of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam has been documented in history as to be one who would stand against the annihilation of the usage of the aql. Why? The school of Ahl al-Bayt emphasizes on the role of the intellect, the role of rational thinking. The first chapter in Al-Kafi is the role of intellect, yes? Whereby we see narrations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the first thing He created was the aql. He says to it come, it came. He said to it go, it went. He said bi'izzati wa jalali, by my might and glory, bika uthibu wa bika u'aqib, by you I will give punishment and through you I will reward. No doubt the school of Ahl al-Bayt has been the defenders of rational thought, rational thinking, rational discourses, isn't it? That's why when we examine Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, what do we find? A number of steps he would undertake. The first one would be that he would speak in narrations about the role of the intellect. He would highlight how aql plays a pivotal role in what? In theology as well as in the lives of human beings. For example, he would come forward and would say, when the Quran says وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, we have created the human beings in the best way. He would come forward and say, أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ, Allah is saying the best way here is because of the intellect, the aql. Don't dismiss it. Similarly, the 10th Imam would come what? And would debate with people who had these kind of ideas and thoughts. In Tuhaf al-Uqul, we have a letter written by the 10th Imam, quite lengthy, regarding predeterminism. He writes this, yes, to a number of individuals who believed in tajseem, and he would present intellectual arguments also from the Quran and the Hadith, which dismisses their belief in anthropomorphism. Similarly, what do we find? He would train individuals to defend intellectual discourses. For example, Al-Fadl ibn Shaban al-Nayshaburi, Muhammad ibn Sa'id al-Ahwazi, who wrote over 1,000 books. Yes, Shah ibn Abd al-Azim, yes, Al-Hasani, this great individual was also a companion of the 10th Holy Imam, although he is from a great descendant of the 2nd Holy Imam. These people were trained by Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam specifically to have debates, to present arguments regarding what? Regarding proving the role of the intellect. Lastly as well, another thing that Imam alayhi salam would do is through dua literature, he would highlight a number of key beliefs, key important aspects. For example, we have this important dua, Ziyaratul Jami' al-Kabira, where he would emphasize a number of the aqaid beliefs through making people think. Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam played this role. Why? Because when it comes to the school of Ahl al-Bayt, there is an important area that we have to understand. Please focus on this, because there is confusion on this today that I have seen personally when it comes especially to the youngsters about where the role of aql lies within the religion of Islam. In which way? There are people today who come to you and say that intellect should be able to explain everything within the religion. There are those who say, if the school of Ahl al-Bayt played such an important role towards the discussions involving intellectual discourses, then everything must make sense. Everything must be subjected to the aql. How do we look at this question? First of all, there is the theological elements regarding this. In the discussions of our aqidah, there is no doubt that there is a role for aql in this. Improving tawheed, monotheism, when it comes to the justice of Allah, prophethood, imamah, when it comes to some elements regarding eschatology, the belief in akhirah. All this, there is a role for the intellect. I cannot prove to an individual the existence of God by quoting a hadith from Nahj al-Balagha. I am not able to start off with, of course I can later on, to prove God's justice by what? By saying to someone that what? You have to believe in God first, and then I will prove it to you from the Quran. There is a place for some kind of rational arguments presented in this particular regard. But the more you walk towards the latter parts of the Usuluddin, the less the role of the aql becomes evident. Because when it came to the proof of, for example, barzakh, it's very difficult to prove using intellectual arguments. You will need to use naql. You'll need to use narrations. That is why in the subject of imamah, we find a number of our ulama emphasizing on the usage of intellectual discourses. The reason why Sheikh al-Mufid is called Sheikh al-Mufid is because of the famous story that most of you are aware of, the usage of the intellect. Yes, that Sheikh al-Mufid was given this particular title. That's why I remember in a story that I love to often recite, that perhaps I have mentioned, but highlights how you and I need to ensure that our youngsters are within the mindset to be able to discuss theology using rational discourses. A young man who was 12 years of age was in a country that was primarily Shia-phobic, that many would discourage the following of the Ahl al-Bayt or to be one of the Shia. He was in his classroom, and one day the teacher looks at him and says, I want you to come to the front of the class because I'm leaving the class for a few moments and I would like you to make sure that everyone is doing their work. This is a common practice that I remember when I studied in Iran as a young child. I also was selected, like many others, to ensure that the class is what is well organized. When this particular teacher came back, he asked the student to sit down and said to him, thank you for keeping the class orderly. The student, who was one of the followers of the Ahl al-Bayt, only 12 or 13, looks at his teacher and said, sir, I have a question before I sit down. He said to him, what's your question? He said, why did you choose me when there is a class of 20? He said, because if I don't put someone and I leave, there will be chaos. Everybody will feel that they're in charge, and I know how it is. So I have to have someone who has authority from me, who leads and ensure that others respect. He said, but you told us in our history lesson that on the 18th of Dhul Hijjah, when the Prophet said to the people that Ali is the leader after you, as we believe, is not a declaration. It is what? It is just a matter of friendship. And therefore the Prophet never left you said a successor. You in your actions are doing something that indicates that you're better than the Prophet. The man said, how? He said, you are ensuring there's no chaos for 20 in a class, whereas the Prophet left without ensuring there is chaos for the rest of humankind and the Muslim Ummah. He said to him, after a moment of reflecting, you are teaching me, or I should be teaching you. How could you tell me about these things? I'm not allowing you to stay in my class anymore. You are expelled from the school. When he left, he told him to go to the head teacher. The head teacher said to him, tomorrow come back with your wali, the person who's in charge, yes, of you. Next day, he knocks on the door. When he knocks on the door, he says, come in. Did you bring your wali? He said, yes. He said, where is he? He's outside. Bring him. When he brings him, it turns out to be his friend. The head teacher looks at him and says, how dare you, you're belittling me. I said to you, bring your wali. He said, yes, I have. He said, how could you? He said, for the last few years you have told us, man kuntu mawlah means whomsoever I am the friend of. Wali means friend. Therefore, I'm doing exactly what you've told me. He said, how dare you? I said, wali in reference within the context that he is in charge of you. He said, that's why you are not using your aql and we are. When the Prophet stops 120,000 people in the heat of the desert and he lifts the hands of Ali and says, man kuntu mawlah, fahadha aliyun mawlah. It means that Ali has the authority from God after the Holy Prophet, not a friend. And therefore you recognize that there is a role in intellectual discourse when it comes to providing evidence regarding Aqeedah. But the area in which there is a bit of a misunderstanding that exists today is where aql is used in jurisprudential rulings. Why is this important? Because up until today, before I came here, I receive number of questions on a daily basis, mostly from a younger generation, who say, what is the evidence for a particular ruling? Chess, for example. I am not convinced, they say, that it is haram according to Ayatollah Sistani. It's haram, for example, as it is, yes? And it's not something that he has obligatory precaution. He says fatwa, it's haram. He is absolutely sure. Ayatollah Wahid Khurasani, the same. Ayatollah Khoi, the same. Yes, a number of our maraja. But a number of other maraja say no. When it came to this, there are a number of people who question. They say, okay, listen, if you say the religion of Islam plays an important role when it comes to the usage of the aql, why can't we use our intellect here? I say to them, how? He said, look, chess, it's very good for your aql. Number one. Number two, the narrations, when they came to say that the playing is haram, they meant gambling, because chess was played back in the time solely for gambling, they say. Yes? So when we use our aql today, we come to the conclusion that when it comes to chess, it should be halal. Now, there are these arguments that are presented out there, not only for this, even for hijab, for example, yes, even for certain other practices, khums, and certain other jurisprudential rulings. That people say, I, as a believer, I am an advocate of using intellectual reasoning. It doesn't sit well with me, certain rulings. Therefore, I will only practice it if it's acceptable to my brain. A huge movement is now pushing towards this. Yes? Do it only if it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, yes, leave it. Because surely Islam makes sense. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought this religion, which is what? Which is very much compatible with the human mind, with the human intellect. I remember once in the United States, I was with a community and there was a Q&A session. And the father, one day, before the Q&A session, came to me, one of the elderly of the community came to me and said, may Allah help you tomorrow. I said, why? He said, my daughter has asked every alim that has come to this community, and no alim has given her the right answer in her mind. She's still not convinced, and she's going to ask you this question tomorrow. I was thinking this is going to be the hardest philosophical question ever. Next day, she was sitting there in the ladies section, and she asked the question. She said, no one has answered this question to me satisfactorily, so I am hoping that you can. I said, Bismillah, let's see. She said to me, why are men not obliged to wear hijab by Allah? Why is hijab only wajib for women? Now, you now sitting there, you might be thinking, easy. I know how to answer her, yes? Majority of people will answer the following. Women's hair is attractive. They can use it to cause people to be attracted to them, yes? And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who created her in that such a way, wants her hair to be covered and her body also to be covered in such a way, because it's a cause of attraction. Most of you would say this or no? Yes? Makes sense, no? The problem is, most of the ulama had told her this and she'd rejected it. Why? She'd rejected it because there are today many men who are very attractive. They have very nice hair. And so, okay, if that's the rule, then make the men wear hijab also, some of them. I said to her sister, I have the answer for you. She said, really? Finally. I said, however, my answer to you is not free. She said, what do you mean? I said, if you answer my question, I will give you the answer to your question. Is that a deal? She said, deal. I said, my question is, prove to me through the aql and the reasoning why Fajr is ruk'atain and Maghrib is 3. She pondered, looked at me and said, that's not fair. I said, why? She said, Allah made it this way. I said, the answer to your question is, Allah made it this way. What is happening in the world today as a realization of the role of the intellect in fiqh is there is a lot of confusion. Because you hear from the minbar that everything makes sense in Islam, there are people today who want fiqh to make sense. Here we have to make a statement. It doesn't have to make sense to you and I. It makes sense to Allah, but it doesn't have to make sense to us. That we have to inculcate to our children and our youth, and sometimes our elders. If I am not convinced about the whole discussion regarding chess, if I'm not convinced, for example, regarding the idea that in Islamic law, men have the right for divorce, I'm not convinced. There are many of our sisters who are not convinced about this. They feel angry sometimes when there are conflicts, right? And they are not able to obtain the divorce. There is a way out, by the way. If they were able to do this, for example, prenuptial contract before, where they are given the right by the husband. But if they haven't done it, that's something else. In the essence of it, they don't have it. Now, I am not convinced. Why should I, as a female, not have the right for talaq as my husband has? Yes? There are so many of these aspects of jurisprudence that may not in any shape or form make sense to you and I. How do we approach them? How do we deal with them? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us a prescription in the Quran. Allah tabarak wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. It is not for males, as far as believers, males or females, when Allah and His Messenger have said something, they don't have a choice. But Maulana, we're not sheep. We should know why we're doing things. Yes, Bismillah. Come and ask questions, we'll show you hadith. But if you're not a mujtahid or a marji', with all my love and respect to each and every individual, you have no right to say, I am not convinced. And I mean it, and I repeat it. No right. Today, in the world, every discipline has experts, and people respect the experts in that discipline. Medical world, they are experts. They know what they're talking about, yes? When it comes to, for example, astronomy, they know what they're talking about, yes? Physicists, they know what they're talking about. Those to do with virus. But when it comes to deen and fiqh, everyone's an expert. Oh, but Maulana, surely this and surely that. Surely this. What we need to develop within our communities is the sublime quality of taslim and submission. Taslim and submission was something that the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam advocated and would be very much keen for people to engulf within themselves and embrace in their lives. Today, our youngsters need to understand that it's actually liberating if you and I trust the marja' al-taqleed, follow the rulings, yes, and not waste our time and stress over so many of these rulings that doesn't necessarily seem to make sense to us. Whereas we focus on our aqeedah, focus on our spirituality, focus on our akhlaq, ask on those areas, develop on those areas. Fiqh, leave it to the experts. You want to know the background behind the rulings of certain maraj'? No problem. You come and see. But it's not dependent on you following it or not. There is a difference between asking just for inquisitive nature. I want to see how the ruling is derived. No problem. And there's a difference by saying, no, if I am not convinced that this is halal or haram, I will not do it. Today, that is where some ideologies and isms are pushing the minds of our youth. Only accept it if it makes sense to you. If it doesn't, don't accept it. I'll give you an example. LGBTQ. Plus. Somebody comes to you and says, make it make sense to me why Islam has a position on this. They have the right, they are born this way, there is a gene, they give you all the stuff that's out there. They'll tell you all this stuff. Yes? And then you enter in this wide discussion about it where you will not reach anywhere. What is the only answer that you can give? It is says in the religion of Islam that it's haram and it's not acceptable. End of story. But Maulana, I need to be convinced why it's haram. Why do you need to be convinced it's haram? Why? Tell me why. You are a believer, you are a Muslim. Oh, but I'm convincing a non-Muslim. Who told you you should? But I'm engaging in a massive debate with a non-Muslim. Okay, you can engage in a debate with a non-Muslim. That is fine. That is absolutely okay. You may get somewhere, you may not. What it comes down to is this. The religion says it's not acceptable to be part of this. Yes, that's the belief within the religion of Islam. Don't go anywhere else. Embrace it. This empowering. There is no need to then go into all the theories and the different beliefs and the aspects that are related to it. And that's why we find that within this kind of thinking, we can then begin to really appreciate the role of the aql. It has a role in jurisprudential rulings, but the maraja use it. Today, I am not able to use the aql in deriving laws as a believer. I can use aql to interpret laws, yes. Yes, sometimes my situation entails that I use, okay, where am I? The ruling says this. Am I entitled to this? No problem. That is where the usage of the aql is existent. Yes, no doubt. But I am also recognizing that there are so many rules within Islamic jurisprudence that I may never be able to explain. And I've been asking this question, a lot of sisters who have been objecting in the past few months. I said to them, anyone give me a reason why in your monthly period, you are not to pray and not to fast. But when it is the month of Ramadan, you do not fast. But after, do you make it up or not? What about prayers? You don't. So which is more important, salah or saum? Salah, of course. It's the first thing will be asked on the day of Qiyamah. But that doesn't make sense. One lady said, yes, it's Allah being merciful on us. This is from you. Give me a hadith that says this. This is your own conjecture. To say that Allah has been merciful on you, therefore He has not made you to do the salah and not the fast. He has said, no, you make the salah fasting up, but not the salah. And hence you recognize that this is a key element that we have to keep reminding ourselves in order for us to be in the footsteps of these holy individuals as we remember them. And as the Ahl al-Bayt themselves would say, Shi'atuna khuliqu min fadili tinina. Our Shia are the ones that have been created from the remains of what was used to create us. يَفْرَحُونَ لِفَرَحِنَا وَيَحْزَنُونَ لِحُزْنِنَا. They are pleased when we are pleased, and they are saddened when we are saddened. This means that the Ahl al-Bayt want us to be submissive individuals. Submissive to the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Submissive to what the Ahl al-Bayt alayhum salam have presented us. And that's why one of the things that the Ahl al-Bayt would continuously present us and encourage us to continue, and the Ahl al-Bayt followers have truly been submissive, is the remembrance of their masa'ib, the remembrance of their tragedies, their difficulties, their pain and their suffering. Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam was amongst those who had to endure such pain when he was in Surra man ra'a insa marra in his final days. We are told that who is next to him? Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, his son, peace be upon him. The riwayat tells us that the poison that was given to him by the ruthless Abbasid ruler had spread all throughout his body. He was indeed lying on his bed. Next to him was Imam al-Askari alayhi salam. The riwayat tells us it was a difficult moment for Imam al-Askari. It was a difficult moment for a number of other members of the Ahl al-Bayt. You know who was there? Lady Hakima was there also. She is whom? She is the sister of Imam al-Hadi. We have the blessed mother of Imam al-Askari, the wife of Imam al-Hadi. Her name is Sulayl or Salil. She was there. A number of the Ahl al-Bayt were surrounding this honorable individual. Imam al-Hadi all of a sudden requests something from Imam al-Askari. That thing that Imam requests was something unusual. Do you know why? Because many a times people aren't able to explain why would someone do this, but the Ahl al-Bayt know exactly why they would do this. Imam al-Hadi says, "Oh my son, please help me to come out of the house." He said, "Father, look at your state. Where do you want to go?" He said, "Just help me and take this particular bed with me and let's go." He helps Imam al-Hadi slowly go outside the house. They went outside the house. It was during the day. There was the sun rays. It was hot. Imam al-Hadi says, "Allow me to lie here. Yes, put this mat of mine here. Let me lie here under the sun." Imam al-Askari does exactly what Imam al-Hadi asks him to. At that moment, Imam al-Hadi is under the heat of the sun. He indeed is sweating. Yes, sweating gradually. There is the poison in his body, but it's becoming hotter and hotter. But Imam al-Hadi doesn't do anything. The poet says, I can imagine Imam alayhi salam weeping, shedding the tears. Why, Ibn Rasulullah? He's then asked by his son Imam al-Askari, "Oh my father, why are you in this state?" He says, at least I can feel just a little bit from what my grandfather Hussein felt on the plains of Karbala. Allahu Akbar. You know, the Ahl al-Bayt are not only about reciting Masa'ib of Karbala. They're not only about ma'tam and tears. They wanted to feel some part of the pain of Hussein, some part of the tragedy of Abu Abdullah. That's why the narration says that when Imam Sajjad returned back from the burial of his father, the riwayat tells us there was a link to this. The riwayat tells us these ladies, they gathered around him in Kufa. One of them said, "How did you bury my father?" Another said, "How did you find my brother?" He began to explain how each of the Shahadah of Karbala were buried, until there was one lady who was standing at the back. That lady waited for everyone to clear. She then walked towards Imam Zayn al-Abidin. She said to him, "My nephew Zayn al-Abidin, tell me, how did you find the body of Abu Abdullah?" Sayyida Zainab is asking about Hussein. Yes, how did you find his body 3 days under the rays of the sun? She's asking, did the rays of the sun burn his body? Allahu Akbar. Tell me, how did you bury my brother Abu Abdullah? How? Explain to me. Zainab wants the musibah, wants the full details of how Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was buried. That's why when Imam Zayn al-Abidin tells her of how he buried Imam al-Hussein, he then looks to her, the tears in her eyes. She says, "Did you find my brother Abbas?" Allahu Akbar. Where did you find his body? Next to the Furat. What did you do, O Zayn al-Abidin? He says to her, "O Zainab, I walked towards the body, but on the way I was looking for the arms of Abbas. I found the severed arms of Abu al-Fadl, my uncle. I kissed the arms and I buried the arms with his body." Allahu Akbar. That's why in Medina, when Sayyida Zainab returned with the Ahl al-Bayt, there was a sight that indeed reminds us of this musibah. Yes, the sight is what is her husband Abdullah ibn Ja'far. When he was told, "How did you receive your wife? How did you receive the family, the captives of the Ahl al-Bayt?" Wallah, what he says breaks the heart. He says, "When I first looked at the women, I began to look for my wife Zainab, but I never recognized her when she stood in front of me." They said to him, Why? He says, "Her face was burnt by the heat of the sun." ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين وإنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to raise us with Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. We pray to Him to grant us the tawfiq to visit the shrine of Imam al-Hadi in Samarra sometime soon and to attain his shafa'ah. We pray to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant shifa to all mu'mineen and mu'minat who are suffering with ailments and illnesses. We pray to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the appearance of our 12th Imam and to make us of his devout and sincere followers. Please recite Surah Al-Mubarakah Al-Fatiha for the souls of all marhumeen. Al-Fatiha.
Ya Hussein, 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 Ya Hussein. हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, ये दाग कलेजे का, ये दाग कलेजे का मिटाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता। कहते हैं अलमदार के दे मौत खुदाया, कहते हैं अलमदार के दे मौत खुदाया, मुँह प्यासी सकीना को दिखाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता। शहबोले कमर टूटी संभा लो अली अकबर, शहबोले कमर टूटी संभा लो अली अकबर, अब्बास सदा देते कि जाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता। अकबर तो छुपाते हैं कि शबीर न देखे, अकबर तो छुपाते हैं कि शबीर न देखे, हाथों से मगर जख्म छुपाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता। कासिम की न उम्मीद रखो बादर कासिम, कासिम की न उम्मीद रखो मादर कासिम, लाशे की ये हालत है कि लाया नहीं जाता, हमसे गम शबीर बुलाया नहीं जाता, ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا یا مولا علی یا رسن باستہ ہے زینب یا مولا علی یا رسن باستہ ہے زینب بے بس ہے سکینہ کو چرایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا ان بیویوں میں مادر اکبر ہے کہ جس کا ان بیویوں میں مادر اکبر ہے کہ جس کا ایک ہاتھ کلیجے سے ہٹایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا اٹھتے ہیں کبھی بیٹھتے ہیں مولا کے لے اٹھتے ہیں کبھی بیٹھتے ہیں مولا کے لئے کیا لاش فرزند اٹھایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا یہ داغ کلیجے کا یہ داغ کلیجے کا مٹایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا ہم سے غم شبیر بلایا نہیں جاتا یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین محمد و آل محمد صلوات
السلام علیکم یا رسول اللہ السلام علیکم یا نبی اللہ السلام علیکم یا امیر المؤمنین و سید الوسیین السلام علیکم یا فاطمة الزہرا سیدۃ نساء العالمین السلام علیکم یا حسن المجتبی السلام علی الحسین وعلی علی ابن الحسین وعلی اولاد الحسین وعلی اصحاب الحسین خصوصا سيدي مولا أبو الفضل العباس ابن أمير المؤمنين وأختك زينب بنتك السكينة السلام عليك يا شهداء كربلاء ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا مولا وابن مولا السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء وبعيد المدى السلطان أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا كن شفيئنا وشفيئ والدي في يوم الجزاء السلام عليك وعلى أختك فاطمة المعصومة ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا حجة ابن الحسن يا صاحب العصر والزمان سيدي علمان 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 من فتنة الزمان السلام عليك يا حجة المنان أجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهور الأمر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقاعدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم